When I was around 15 or so, my mom and stepfather got divorced in a pretty dramatic way. It's like the whole household was just turned upside down. Everyone's routines were off. Mom was out doing something most nights after work. My little sister spent more time with her friends. And I became something of a night owl, usually waiting until the wee morning hours to lie down. Our house was a simple one in a rural area. 2 stories, with a huge backyard sharing a fence with a cow pasture and the entrance to some thick woods. The house had a lot of problems, but I enjoyed taking over the maintenance and gardening work as they gave me something to do when I was feeling depressed. For some perspective, our kitchen windows looked out directly to the fence described above. The left half of the fence bordered one of the back corners of the big cow pasture, while the right half bordered the entrance to the woods, which had a rather overgrown trailhead just barely visible from the kitchen window. For the most part, though, all you could see was overgrown grass and shrubbery, at least 4 or 5 feet high, and some low-hanging trees of mixed oak and cedar. This backdrop added a sort of eerie tranquility to our property, which I appreciated from the first day we moved in. One night, I took a break from my homework after realizing I had stayed up way too late on a Thursday, even for my standards. I went downstairs to make some food, and my dog followed me like she always did. I made a grilled cheese, and while I was at the sink cleaning the pan, I noticed some of the grass from the wood line start to shuffle around. It startled me at first, but as soon as I began to fixate on it, I saw no more disturbance. We lived in wildlife country at the time, so I figured it was probably a deer, coyote, or a cougar. Unsurprising for the latter, given that the farmer who owned the pasture had dozens of cows and sometimes didn't bring them in at night. Strangely, though, I noticed this for several more nights, always when I was doing the dishes after eating. I would look out the window, see the grass shuffle around, then see nothing further when I fixated on the spot. I was always a fan of scary movies, and I tended to be a jumpy kid, so each time I convinced myself I wasn't really seeing any sort of pattern. This changed, though, when my dog would start fixating on the woods herself and barking at night. Furthermore, our motion sensor security light would begin to stay activated sometimes for hours on end, only switching off when I would get to the kitchen to make my midnight snacks. Eventually, I told my mom about all this, and while she initially seemed concerned, she pointed out that we did live behind the woods after all, and so we should expect animals or occasional homeless squatters near our property. She said that if I was concerned, I could always call the police or animal control. I didn't disagree, and for the most part gave the matter no further thought. One night, though, I decided that a 1 a.m. dip in our hot tub in the backyard sounded good. I changed, and my dog and I went outside. I climbed in, closed my eyes, and zoned out like usual. I was whipped awake when I heard a loud crunch, followed by what sounded like someone falling over into some bushes. I stood up, turned around, and shouted, "Who's there?" But no one replied. It was dead silent, and I had the creeps. I put my robe on and went inside. The next day I told my neighbor friend and crush about this, and she thought I was being ridiculous, but nonetheless agreed to go with me to check out that part of the woods to see if there was any evidence of anyone or anything hiding in the direction that I had heard the noise coming from. We stomped through the woods until we got to where we could see the back of my house. We checked every shrub and every blackberry bush, but found nothing. It was probably a coyote or something, deciding on whether or not you'd make a good dinner, the neighbor girl said, snarking. I playfully flipped her off, then laughed, quietly relieved that there was no creepy person stalking me the previous night. Well, of course, I might have been wrong about that, because that night, when I was making my usual sandwich, our security light came on, and I raced to the back door to see what was up. I saw what I could barely make out to be a shadowy, 6-foot-tall or so figure disappear from the trail and into the brush to the right of it. My heart skipped a beat. and my dog, probably sensing my nerves, began barking wildly. I opened the door and shouted, "The fuck's out there? Come out!" Of course, there was nothing but silence. After sitting in the dining room for an hour, I figured that I was being paranoid and seeing what I was subconsciously afraid of being out there. I called my neighbor back, and she, surprisingly, did not call me crazy and told me she would tell her dad about it in the morning. I never saw this sort of thing again, and my neighbor's dad chalked it up to being a homeless person camping out in the woods. Or, at the very most, a stalker from one of the houses around ours. Something he explained wouldn't be surprising as my sister was quite a looker, and he thought it made sense that she would have a stalker, as if this was supposed to make me feel better. Well, I suppose it did in the end, as months passed and I forgot about it fairly quickly. That is, until a local news bulletin came out about a sexual predator having been recently apprehended by local police, after a report from a couple living a few houses down from us was filed about the wife being approached by the tall and gaunt man in the evening hours as she was watering her garden boxes. She said he suddenly appeared, quietly as if he were trying to sneak up on her. When she noticed him, she demanded his name, but he darted back into the woods. She called the sheriff immediately, and half an hour or so later the department combed through the woods and apprehended the man, who was hiding under a fallen tree. All the report said was that the man claimed he was living in the woods for months, surviving on snacks from a nearby gas station, and would not give a reason for why he was out there. However, he was apparently wanted for numerous sexual offenses on minors and vulnerable adults some years prior, whatever those ended up being. Now, years later, I still get uncomfortable looking into the woods at night, anywhere I live. Who can blame me? There has always been folklore around black crows and their cawing that my mother has always believed in. I've always been in love with anything creepy, so I bought into black crows aesthetically, but never actually believed that they served as an omen for death, as they're commonly known for. That was until I was told this story later in my life. My mother is from Central America and was born and raised there, only moving to the United States around 2000. She's always been superstitious. She would tell me when I was a kid to be careful around crows. Try not to let one fly in my path or disturb one, because they symbolize death and can predict it if someone in your life is about to die. I was just a kid, so, again, I never really believed any of that, and just promised to follow these rules to please her. It was still hot and sunny out when I was beginning elementary school, and my mother and father were at home painting our back deck as we had just moved into a new house. This was the first house that we lived in since my mother moved from Central America to the States. All of my mother's family were thousands of miles away from her. She was always worried that something would happen to someone in her family while she was gone. My father was on all fours painting the deck, and my mother had come outside to give him a drink when a black crow swooped down right over my father's head. My mother immediately began to panic and cry. Before my father had a chance to ask her what was wrong, the home phone rang. My mother picked up the phone, crying, and burst into Spanish asking, "Is it Dad?" and "What happened?" before she even knew who was on the other side of the call. It was my mother's family, calling to tell her that her father had indeed just passed away. I came home that evening, and my father explained that my grandfather had passed on, but he didn't tell me of the crow story. When I was a little older, my mother had told me the story, and my father confirmed the order of the events. That story is so strange to me, and ever since then I, too, have been wary of crows and their presence in my life. My mother said that she just knew her father had died in that moment, When the phone rang, she knew she was getting the phone call. I find it interesting that the crow flew so low over my father, perhaps directly symbolizing that a father figure in someone's life had passed away. Where I live, around that time of year, a crow should have been nowhere in sight. There had not been any around that day, or for months even. All of it is just a little too bizarre and creeps me out to this day. A few months back, really closer to a year ago, a friend of mine suggested that we do something interesting with our night for once. He told me about how he had been to one of the city's cemeteries after dark a few times, and that it terrified him, but in that sort of way that makes it worthwhile. I was a little against it at first, because the cops like to check on the area often, and there was no way we were going to be walking into the graveyard sober. Of course, however, my mind changed when we got to talking. "You know about the witch?" He started cracking a grin. "I think so." I had heard very little. "Remind me, just in case." "So there's supposed to be this witch or ghost or some crap, and I know right where the grave is." Jesus, alright. I don't know exactly what I believe, but I know that the place is messed up. He paused, thinking hard. I said, "I honestly don't believe in anything, but a dark graveyard is scary anyway. Definitely need to check it out sometime if we don't get to it tonight." He popped up with, "Oh man, I just remembered there are these dead kids." "What?" "There's a bunch of graves together for this one family, and a bunch of them are these kids. That spot is extra creepy. They're all old as hell, from like the 1800s or something." "Well, I guess we gotta go see all of it." We pulled into the lot when the sun was setting and decided to smoke a little bit in the car since we had time anyway. As we smoked, the whole place emptied out, and we were the only ones in sight. By this point, we were at a comfortable level of dissociative perfection, so we brought just a little bit of it with us. And, of course, my pack of cigarettes, which is no longer a habit of mine, but at the time was a means for managing stress. So, off we went, with a bit of sun still shining and one single truck riding through the cemetery. We figured it would be good to wait for the truck to leave, assuming it was a worker watching for any unwanted guests. Although they had left the gates wide open, we were a little unsure of the legality of being around after dark, and a little bit uneasy about some psycho employee ratting on us and getting us caught with what we had. After about 10 minutes and 3 or 4 rounds of the truck passing by, we figured it would be smart to just go ahead and hide wherever we were if he passed by us again. We made our way down the main hill that leads into the center of the cemetery, and we noticed a chill that seemed to pass as we entered the real part. I passed it off as a weird current made by the creeks and the cooler air in that area, but a part of the primal fear that remained in the back of my mind made me question my devotion to reality. There were a few times where we had to hide behind a tree as the truck made its way back around, and then we would make a few more minutes of progress. As we began to become too close to sober, we imbibed a bit more. Another 30 minutes or so passed, and we had decimated almost our entire on-hand supply. We also had no clue where we were. As we wandered along the dark, winding roads, we started to get concerned about our phone batteries. His phone was worse off than mine, being near dead already, although mine was hardly doing better. After deciding to keep them in our pockets for the time being, the dark and discomforting silence started to make both of us paranoid. It was, of course, a bit heightened by our habits. We also noticed something else that was upsetting. We had started to go around in circles. As we realized this, I had the first real wave of fear for that night come rushing over me. I could swear that someone was inside one of the mausoleums with their face just barely out of view and moving around in the shadows. Dude, do you see that? On instinct, I grabbed for my inhaler. "What? What the hell are you talking about?" my friend said. "In that, right there." I looked toward the window rather than pointing. I swear to Christ, I just saw someone in there. I saw the shadow of a face. My friend brushed me off. You're just freaked out because you smoked too much. It's nothing. Come on, we need to get to the witch, and then we can get the hell out of here. You still want to go see that? Well, yeah. If you don't want to, that's cool, but I'm gonna. I mean, alright, I'm cool with doing that, but I'm just getting a little out of it. About 3 cigarettes and another hour later, we heard something unnerving. At first, we assumed that it was a bunch of drunk teenagers, based on the volume and range of noises being made. Walking further, we found a sign for construction, and being high, we thought it made perfect sense that a group of construction workers must be around. You know, for some good nighttime, silent construction work. Then the voices began to get a bit too quiet for our comfort. We booked it, barreling in no real direction, and somehow ending up at the place. "Here it is," my buddy exclaimed. "This is it?" I looked to a massive circle of tall, dry grass. "Is it in the middle of this?" "No, man," he replied. "It's way in the back. Come on, I'll show you." I put another cigarette to my mouth with a slight tremble in my hand and followed him through the pitch black and to a large stone structure in a patch of dirt. It was the family he had mentioned, and it made my stomach turn. The cold, rushing wave of fear came back, but it was too late to change my mind. We walked onto the large stone slab and then around it. As we walked around it, he pulled his phone back out to read the headstones. I was nervous with his light being on at this point, after being near those people that we had seen. After a minute, he turned to me. "You want to see the really messed up part?" "Messed up how?" I asked. "The forgotten children. Their graves are back there down a skinny path." He motioned toward the trees. "You down?" "Well," I said, "I've got my smokes. Let's go." We looked at the graves, and my stomach turned, but I was unsure of why. I disliked the idea of dead kids, but my demeanor would never call for me to feel as sick as I did at that moment. Then my friend flipped his phone light back on to read off the names and dates. I started to really become anxious at that point, even voicing it. I scanned the woods, unable to see anything. My friend told me to just calm down, that the people we had seen had probably left by now. Then we heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the woods. At most, it was 50 feet away. It was an unusual scream, aggressive almost. It didn't sound as if someone were hurt, but more that they were threatening us. I was sure at the time that it was a woman, but the hopeful side of me likes to imagine that we just heard some animal. As we paced back down the path toward the stones at the base, I pulled a few cigarettes from my pocket and began to light them like crazy. This was pushed further by my friend stopping to read more stones, as we saw no one following us. Within 10 minutes he had had his fill, and we continued back into the main area. After even more walking, we passed a group of cars parked in a grass patch. We assumed they must have belonged to the group of people from earlier, but we began to wonder why more than 1 or 2 people would be there for so long. Then we got lost for real. Deep in the back of the property, we found the witch's spot, but nothing of interest, so we decided to head back. By now his phone had died, so we used mine to get a map up. We had 30 minutes of walking to get through to get to the car. Halfway back, we started hearing voices again, loud and brash. However, as we got closer, they got less energetic. I peered ahead and froze, grabbing my friend and shushing him. I could see 3 large shadows right down the path from us. I also forgot my phone screen was on, and heard something I'll never forget. "Wait," a deep voice murmured. "Do y'all see that?" "See what?" A second man joined in. "That, right there." The silhouette of his arm pointed directly to us. That light. I slapped my phone screen against my torso, panicking in an attempt to turn it off. Both of us held our breath, staying still as statues while that group kept discussing. "Go check it out then," chimed a woman's voice. "Or are you too scared?" Why don't you stay here and check it out while we leave?" "Oh, screw off," she teased, in a way that helped me think they were decent people. We started to shimmy toward the patch of graves to our side, hoping they would forget about us and leave like they had said. But then we saw what kind of people they really were. The first man hushed both of the others, and nearly gave me a heart attack. "Let's get 'em." Both men darted toward us, but we were out of sight by then, low to the ground by the hill that we had run across, hiding. We heard them making their way around the area, and we somehow circled behind them, making it out. Then we heard cars starting. For about 20 minutes, these psychos circled through the paths, looking for us, and it cost us another half-hour overall. Exhausted, we made our way to the entrance, with an empty cigarette box, an empty bag, and a little bit of paranoia. We got back to his place and spent at least another hour talking about how insane that all of it had been, and then we had a thought. A ridiculous, but unnerving thought. What if we saw nothing at the witch's spot, because she had been in the woods by the family? And then an even worse thought popped up. What if the scream wasn't aggressive like I thought, and those people had done something to someone right near us? Whatever really happened, I know one thing. I'm never going back there without a full group of friends and fully charged phones. I have had 2 premonitions up to now. Both happened in 1992, a long time ago, but a year full of disasters in the Netherlands. In both dreams, I was standing in front of a window, observing the disaster unfolding. These dreams were also so vivid that I can still remember them in clear detail. The first one was that suddenly, I was in an office looking outside overlooking a chemical factory. I immediately knew that it was the Sindhu factory nearby. Suddenly, one of the reactor vessels exploded, setting the whole of the factory into flames. A few days later, on July 8, 1992, it did indeed happen. A trainee operator used the wrong recipe for the process. The reactor vessel overheated. The company brigade started cooling the vessel down, but to no avail. The vessel exploded. One of the valves was found 2 kilometers away. The 3 firemen died, and 11 other employees were injured, of which 1 had very severe burns. A few months later, at the end of September in 1992, suddenly I again had a vivid dream of standing in front of a window, this time at the Zilmer area in the southeast of Amsterdam. I saw military planes dropping bombs on a block of apartments. In the early evening of October 4th, 1992, an El Al cargo Boeing took off from Amsterdam Airport, heading to Tel Aviv. Just after takeoff, the captain notified traffic control that they had lost power in 2 engines and requested to return. What he didn't know was that he not only lost power in these engines, he physically lost the 2 engines. I think that they were actually the bombs that I thought I saw falling. The captain had very big troubles in controlling the airplane. He made some circles go up to the point that he could not hold the plane anymore, and it plunged almost nose down into the corner where 2 blocks of apartments met. It left a burning hole of rubble, 8 stories over a length of about 10 apartments, gone. The death toll was 43, of which 4 were aboard the plane. I have since then not had these kinds of dreams anymore. Maybe because both disasters happened within a radius of less than 10 kilometers from where I lived back then. This story comes from my girlfriend, who told me that a couple of months ago her mom was exiting an office that she works at in the middle of the night when she saw an apparition. She described it as looking like a very abnormally large black dog that was staring her down in the parking lot. Apparently the dog charged at her and vanished as it went through her, never to be seen again after that. Now, my girlfriend's mom is no stranger to the paranormal and has tons of crazy stories, and this being the latest incident, she knew it meant something bad. She called my girlfriend frantically, asking her to check on her grandpa, who they were taking care of for about a year at that point, but he was okay. 2 days later, however, he passed on. This also happened to my girlfriend's grandma on her mom's side, where she was outside and saw a large, black dog on the roof of her house staring her down until it jumped down and vanished into her as well. Her first husband died after she received this visit from the dog. From what I could take from the story, it seemed more immediate than just 2 days. It was the first I've ever heard of a large black dog figure appearing, and a few hours later my curiosity led me to searching for similar experiences online. I stumbled across mythology and folklore, speaking of how large black dogs and/or hellhounds are omens of death. I live in a forest outside of a large Croatian city. I consider myself lucky to live in a place so remote and peaceful, yet so close to civilization. It especially came as a blessing during the quarantine. That being said, living in this forest has its quirks that make you question how much of a heaven the place you call home actually is. I moved here around 5 years ago, but it was today that I finally discovered the dark truth about its past. I'd like to share what I found, but let's take it back first, to the day when I realized that there might be something more to this place than the human eye can perceive. It was a hot summer day a few years ago, and I was walking my dogs through the forest. I had recently discovered a new path that I had never walked before, as I didn't know how long it was and how much time that it would take to walk through. This time, though, I had the whole day for myself, so I finally gave in to my curiosity and ventured into the unexplored area. It seemed fairly normal, although it was way more quiet and seemed more isolated than the rest of the forest paths. The path was surrounded by steep valleys on both sides, which ended in deep wooded areas at the bottom, probably inhabited only by animals, or at least nothing human. I stopped for a moment to give my dogs water and take a short break. I was sitting on the ground while they drank, and I was enjoying the calming sounds of the forest, until the peaceful atmosphere was sharply interrupted by something downright disturbing. I heard a human voice shouting from the bottom of a valley. But not just any voice. It was my voice. And it was calling my name. I stayed there for a couple more moments, just to make sure that I was hearing it right, as it didn't make any sense. Sure enough, it was calling my name, again and again. I got up and ran home as fast as I could. Every step of the way I felt watched, and more paranoid, as if I were being chased. I did my research at home. I wanted to find an explanation as to what had happened to me. It fit the profile of a skinwalker. I don't feel entirely confident to conclude that that's what it actually was, though. As I already said in the beginning, I'm from Croatia, and I don't know enough about skinwalkers to know if they can be found here, if they even exist. Anyhow, that possibility didn't make me any more comfortable. Unfortunately, it wasn't a single event. This was only the beginning of strange happenings for me in that forest. I have a hard time falling asleep, so I usually go out for a nightly stroll up and down the street before I go to bed. My street is surrounded by forest, but it didn't used to scare me. I was used to the way the darkness looks material in the trees, and I made peace with being exposed by the streetlights to anything that lurks within. After what I encountered, though, I can't shake the feeling of being watched, and the sound of leaves rustling as if someone were walking in there in the dark every night that I take that walk. I will also sometimes hear my name being called from a distance, just like that summer day. I play it safe, so I casually stroll back into the house when it gets too intense, when I feel surrounded by invisible eyes preying on me, just waiting for the right moment. You have to play it cool. Don't let them know you know that they're there. Seem completely unbothered. Now, that skinwalker theory had stuck with me for a long time, even though I can't prove it. I feel like I was being stalked by one. That wasn't until today, when I found out about something I think I should have known a long time ago. I always knew my forest is an unusual place. Part of it is a memorial park, full of strange monuments. I thought those were just there for soldiers that died during the war and didn't think much else of it. I'm currently in my 4th year of high school and we're learning about the World Wars, so that sparked some curiosity to find out more about the forest. What I found left me in shock. Basically, horrible war crimes had taken place exactly there, and the ground is filled with mass graves of the executed and tortured soldiers. According to the official site of the Memorial Park's virtual museum, it is the quote-unquote site where the worst mass war crimes in the modern history of the city of Zagreb were committed. I was shocked, to say the least. Finding that information left me completely speechless. You'd think I had finally gotten my conclusion, an answer to what it is that haunts my forest. Instead, it just left me with even more questions. I don't know what entity spies on me, or what its intentions are. I don't even know if it's an individual, or if there's more of them working in unison against something that doesn't belong. The only thing I know for sure is the way it feels. In some way, my concerns seem justified. I most likely am not the only thing roaming these woods at night. The forest feels heavier now. The weight of the truth combined with the burden of worry leaves the night air tingling with tension. Oh, how the tables have turned. The presence I worry about the most right now is me. I might actually be the one disturbing the peace of things that were quietly buried in the soil. As much as I don't know their intentions, they also don't know about mine. I wish there was a way to make it clear that I approve of their ownership of these grounds, that I am okay with being merely a guest, privileged by their peace. So until further notice, I am the one haunting this place. This incident happened to me when I was 14, and I've told the story and gone over it in my mind so many times exactly as it happened that it feels as if it were just yesterday. My uncle, 2 younger cousins, aunt, and I had gone up to the Rocky Mountains to have some fresh air and watch the stars. We went up a lot back then, when you were still allowed to at night. Now that park closes at 10, sadly, and our adventures such as this one ended about 3 months after this incident. Those two things are somehow inextricably linked in my mind. I can't help but wonder. We all 5 piled out of my uncle's AMC hatchback, a tight fit, and stood around the car on the side of the dark road talking about life and joking about Mothman. Betty, my aunt, was the first to hear a noise in the woods across the road to our left, but we dismissed it as an animal, and the adults and I, being older and in on the joke, tried to scare the kids. But a loud crash came from the woods, when no one had thrown anything, nobody had gone over there, and I'd had my eyes on the whole group the entire time, which meant that none of us were laughing now. My uncle chuckled nervously. Let's get in the car. We got in silently. Something had changed. The wood was quiet except for the sound of the car itself toiling down the mountain, as something followed our car, moving the trees about 10 yards behind us on the driver's side where the mountains slanted down. Nothing but trees over here, I thought. What the hell could that thing be? Feeling the tension in the car, I took matters into my own hands and leaned out the back driver's side window intrepidly. It was still behind us, crashing through the trees and moving through the treetops, right after our car. My mind grew curious. Go faster, I urged my cousin Brian. He sped down the winding road, but the thing in the forest followed. I looked at the speedometer. 35. We could do this. Go faster, I said. It was keeping pace, but always just behind the car. I was livid that I could not catch a glimpse of whatever was big enough to make such a racket and bend the trees to its whim. I finally yelled at him to go faster, but again the thing kept up. Our tiny car was racing down the winding mountain road, sheer rock on one side of us, certain death on the other, our headlights the only things lighting the way down as we sped out the gate of the park, turned, and peeled down the paved road toward town. The kids were in tears. Brian nearly was too. Betty was silent, something which, if you knew her, you'd know the gravity of the situation when she actually chooses to shut up. Brian was yelling back at me and asking me what that thing was as I crawled back into my seat and buckled up. No, I said dejectedly. I couldn't see a thing. Months later, I tried to talk to my family about the occurrence, and found that none of them even remembered it except Betty. They had blocked it out of their memories, I guess from sheer shock, the poor souls. Even to this day, my uncle and younger cousins don't even want to talk about it. Looking back now and having watched a lot of Bigfoot investigations since, it's a likely possibility that what I didn't see was a Sasquatch. However, there were things even weirder than that in this local area. This may have been a huge coincidence, but last January I applied for my grandfather's military service records. He died in 1981, way before I was born. I applied for his records and didn't think anything more of it. Several months went by, and I assumed that things were just moving slowly. 6 months later, without hearing any news of his records arriving, one night I had a very vivid dream. I don't often remember my dreams anymore. In my dream, I was in a very white, very bare room with high walls and a high ceiling. On a small table in front of me was a box, and inside was my grandfather's military service history. The dream simply revolved around my taking a good look through them. Nothing too exciting. The next morning I wake up and remember the dream, maybe around an hour after I got up. 10 minutes later, a large envelope drops through my letterbox. It was my grandfather's service records. Odd? Just coincidence? A second, much stranger event occurred on the evening when my grandmother passed away. She had passed in the early morning and had been taken to the Chapel of Rest, which was not too far from the apartment where I was living. That evening, my parents invited me and my girlfriend for a dinner to celebrate her life. In the car, as we drove past the chapel, a leaf landed on the windscreen. The leaf was a perfect heart shape, upside down, so that the light from the streets illuminated the perfectness of the heart shape onto the car's dashboard. The leaf stayed on the windscreen for a minute or so, and right as we turned away and out of our town, it blew off and back toward the chapel itself. I do have a video of the leaf and the heart on the windshield. For a while afterward, shuffling footsteps and noises kept occurring in my parents' house, and they sounded exactly how my grandmother used to walk. We all heard them moving across the upstairs landing. After around 2 weeks, it stopped, and has never happened since. Odd, strangely comforting, and food for thought for a semi-skeptic who finds the subject of the paranormal fascinating. Two years ago, I was hanging around with a group of mates in a small forest. Now, we've done this before more than once, and never really had anything weird happen except on 2 separate occasions. The first encounter that we had was a weird formation of stars slowly moving around in the sky in a triangle, and within a span of 2 seconds going incredibly fast and moving out of our view. All 7 of us saw this, so I know that it wasn't just my imagination. Now, the second encounter freaked us out the most. This happened at exactly the same location as where we saw the star formation. We were just casually hanging around in the midsummer, when around 2:30 out of the blue I saw someone standing near us. I should point out that he was standing behind one of my friends, who I had just talked to about 3 seconds before. Everything about this guy struck me as off-putting. I should also point out that it was about 30 degrees Celsius at this time, but this guy was wearing clothes that you would wear in Siberia during the winter. He also wore sunglasses despite it being nighttime. The moment that I saw him, I instantly felt an intense sensation of dread. The others felt this as well. I asked him what he was doing here, and he just said, listening. After he said that, he moved a couple meters, but there was something really wrong with the way that he moved, as it looked like this guy glided over the ground. Because he got closer, I told him to stay back, and he just looked at me. In that moment, my fight or flight was kicking in hard, and I got the feeling that this guy was a genuine threat, so I got ready to defend myself if he attacked us. But just a second or two after, he looked at me again and just vanished. Like we were all looking at him, and one moment he was there, and the other, he was just gone. After our initial confusion, we decided that we should book it out of there, and we just ran as fast as possible out of the forest. Just a few notes. We didn't use any substances that could have influenced what we experienced. We didn't consume any drugs, alcohol, or anything else. We also remember quite well what happened that day. We're also well known in that forest, and because it's quite small, we have been everywhere in there, and never have we found any signs of homeless people, or anything like that. When I was young, I lived in a small, one-story house in a bad community a little ways south of Atlanta, Georgia. My parents bought the house when there were no other houses in the neighborhood, save for 1 or 2 neighbors that weren't exactly close enough to really be counted as proper neighbors. Well, by the time that I had come along and gotten old enough to play outside on my own, there were way more houses. It wasn't a huge neighborhood or anything, but it was way more built up than when my parents originally moved there. Behind my house, there were some woods. The woods were pretty dense, and went on for a few miles before there was a middle school and its football field. Sometimes at night, if it was clear, you could see the stadium lights glow way beyond the tree line. Anyways, in these woods I discovered a creek. My parents told me that when they first moved here, there were all sorts of fish and crawdads living in there. But when I first discovered the creek, I found nothing except for maybe a few tiny minnows. Maybe 5 or so spanning a mile, both up the creek from my house and down the creek. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't live in a very good area. The news was always talking about some shooting or drive-by, but where my neighborhood sat, it was usually more tame. This was in the early 2000s, and I didn't have internet or any sort of gaming console, but it was fine because I loved being outside anyways. even if the mosquitoes were literally the worst, and I have a more severe allergic reaction to their bites. My favorite place to go and hide was out by the creek. But one time I went down, I remember seeing more vultures and scavenging birds flying around and sitting in the trees than normal. But no big deal. It was probably just a dead deer or something. I made my way to the creek and rolled up my jeans to stomp around in the water and kick up mud or whatever I used to do. But before I even finished rolling up my pants legs, I saw something. Still bent over, I was pretty close to a sickly pale, decently fresh-looking, human finger. It startled me for more than one reason, and I shot up like a rocket. There was nothing else around, though. No signs of other people, no blood, no body. Just a finger in the creek behind my house. It bothered me, but I was one of those weird, quiet kids, so it was a few months before I said anything. As it turns out, a few doors down there was a man hiding from the FBI in his sister's house. I never found out if he was an actual killer or anything, but I do remember waking up one night to see SWAT trucks and officers outside. One of the officers knocked on our door to ask my parents a few questions and to check to see if things were all right, and I remembered the finger. Of course, it was months later, so I doubted that it was still there and said nothing. I never heard anything else related to the guy, or the FBI, or the finger. But in my 8, maybe 9-year-old mind, it all seemed connected. And to this day, I'm pretty sure there was a murderer a few doors down from me when I was a kid. I was reading somebody's Reddit post today where they talked about their mother being scared because she heard 3 knocks and related it to the 3-knock omen, which I had never heard of. I decided to do some research on it, and apparently there's a superstition around hearing 3 knocks because it's supposedly followed by a death in the family or someone that's close to you. That has happened to me. A couple years ago, I went to a mountain resort in California for a little over a month and stayed with my sister and brother-in-law who lived there. Around the same time when I came, they got a new roommate. He was a nice guy, maybe in his late 20s, early 30s, an ex-alcoholic, but overall, just a really great guy. I spent a lot of my summer going on hikes and playing video games with him and my brother-in-law, and I would say that I got to know him pretty well, but not as well as my sister and her husband did. The roommate, Jack, had lost a close friend a year or so before when he got drunk and decided to fall asleep outside in the middle of a snowstorm, which apparently happens more often than you would think. Since then, Jack had never so much as touched a beer, and he was quite proud of it. Anyways, it was around my 3rd or 4th week there when my sister and I were watching The Babadook, and it was pretty late at night, around 1, maybe 2 a.m. The movie ended, and she was going to let me sleep in the room with her since Jack and her husband were out camping or something, but I don't really remember what they were doing. It was silent in the house, and all the lights were off when we heard 3 loud, distinct knocking sounds. I asked her if she had heard them, and she said yes, but it was probably just the dryer making noises upstairs. It was a fairly new dryer that didn't make any sound. Maybe around 10 minutes later we heard the same 3 knocks again, but my sister wrote it off to the dryer being noisy once more. It didn't sound like a broken dryer since it was 3 obvious knocks, though. I don't want to go too far into the history of the house or anything, but it was definitely haunted. Things would randomly fly off of shelves, and the lights would randomly turn themselves off. Also, some of the furniture that the house came with had what we thought were blood stains. I wrote that night off to the spirit in their house messing with us since we were watching a scary movie, up until today, when I put everything together. 2 days after I left, they found Jack dead in his room upstairs. They said he drank himself to death, which was surprising considering how proud he was of getting sober. Maybe the death knocks were real, or maybe not. Maybe it was all just a coincidence. What do you think? Also, I should probably also mention that he had a bad liver from his previous drinking problem. I don't really know how that works, but I guess one night of extremely heavy drinking did it for him. I didn't push for more information about his death since it really shook my sister up. All she said was that he drank himself to death. Disclaimer: in no way am I saying that death knocks are 100% real, or that if you hear them, a family member or friend will definitely drop dead. As for the furniture that we thought had blood on it, it might not have been blood. Maybe it was just an odd-colored stain from where something had been spilled. I'm not saying that I'm sure that Jack's death was related to anything that happened in the house. I just made the connection and found it fascinating. This isn't a scary story per se, it's more eerie and odd. Just a disclaimer in case you're expecting otherwise. I met David 18 years ago when I was just 14. He was an idol for me when I first met him. He did so many fascinating things. He was a special effects artist on several television shows that were filmed in Miami, Chicago, and New Orleans. He was a sword/bladesmith, and he would render 3D images to help work on historically accurate swords for museums when the original couldn't be displayed due to research. He was amazing, and through all the years, he never lost his shine. When I was young, I wanted to be just like him. He told me very early on that he hated his name, and went by Monkey. This made me laugh so hard, as he imitated a monkey as he told me his name preference. To his best friends, Heather, Keenan, Pixie, and myself, he wasn't just a person. He was a shining star. Skipping forward many years to 2015, I bought a house in New Orleans. I hadn't quite lost track of him, but I was in my own world because of a death in the family. In late 2016, we reconnected at a club outside of Chicago, and I invited him out to visit me in New Orleans. In spring of 2017, he took me up on that, and he flew down, and it was like no time had passed. He was still the same exact shining star that I remembered. Still the goofy monkey that I remembered. In 2018, I went back to Chicago to help with family, and he stayed in New Orleans. In 2019, I was touring with a band, and we had a stop in New Orleans, and I had found out that our friend Carter had passed away. It hit us both very hard, as Carter was in his early 30s just like me, but we were able to console each other. That was the last time that I saw Monkey, at a funeral. I had brought him a necklace that Carter had made, but I never got the chance to give it to him. We kept in contact over the phone after that, as I needed to get back to Chicago and he chose to stay in New Orleans. 2020, COVID started, and made it impossible to visit for a while. But that brings me to now. November 2nd for me, as I'm currently in the UK, but it was November 1st over there, with the time difference and all. I was woken up by a mutual friend ringing my phone off the hook at 5 a.m. UK time. I answered it, and they didn't give me much info, just that he was in an ambulance and that they needed to get in contact with his parents. Enter Heather again. I called her immediately, and she got everyone in contact. As I was starting to fall asleep again, she called me and let me know that he hadn't made it. I don't remember how I took it over the phone. I think I was just in shock and disbelief. Later that day, I went looking for his social media, and it was all gone. None of us could find it. At some point that evening, I went scrolling through Instagram as one does. One of his deleted profiles popped up, and I clicked on it. How it reactivated after his passing, I have no clue. Immediately, I was drawn to a photo of him, so I clicked on that. The caption was, "Very alive and very well. I hope the same for you. And I know that he was trying to reassure me by leading me to that photo. The photo itself was from 2018, but I had never seen it before. I don't believe in coincidence, so I am damn certain that this was his way of saying goodbye and telling me that he was okay, wherever he is. It still makes me cry, and it will for a while, but I appreciate the message from him. The profile disappeared again the very next day. It might seem mundane to some, but I could almost feel him in the room trying to comfort me. Rest in peace, David Mad Monkey. Those of us still on Earth miss you. In 2017, I was in Northern Ireland for a college field trip. My religious studies class was visiting stone circles to focus on religious geography. On this particular day, it was normal, cloudy, and we were enjoying learning the history of the Bronze Age of Wonder, excitedly waiting to go back to the hotel to begin a new day of pub hopping. I remember the stone circles being separated from the nearby woods with a small wire fence. For some reason we were hanging around the fence, peering at the woods that lay not 20 yards away. We had yet to go into any woods during our trip, staying mainly at the sites surrounded by farmland. I remember wanting very much to go into this old forest for whatever reason. We all seemed to feel curious about it. I decided to climb over the small farm wire fence and see if there was anything interesting in the woods. These woods were different from the woods that I was used to in North America. The branches were thick, too thick to stand in. I had to bend at the waist to traverse them. The ground was covered in a soft, light brown moss broken up by tree roots. I remember quickly moving under the branches, staring at the ground as to not trip. I felt giddy like I was a child going somewhere my parents told me not to. I felt light, and I began to pick up speed. I suddenly looked up to make sure that I wasn't about to run into a tree trunk when something made me stop in my tracks. I saw legs. Human legs. I could only see their legs, like someone was standing straight up in the trees. The branches again were too thick to stand in, but this person's legs were the only thing visible. I felt an almost animal response of fear that didn't really make any sense. I told myself that they couldn't see me because I couldn't see their face, but for some reason I felt that they knew I was there. Why would someone be out here? We were the only group at the circles, and there were no houses nearby. I looked behind me and realized that I was much farther into the woods than I had thought. I could barely see the light from the place where I had originally entered. It was so quiet. They had to have heard me approach. My only thought was, I'm closer to them than I am to the entrance. They could get me before I make it out. I was only standing there, bent over for no more than a minute, but it felt like forever. I didn't see them move, but I could tell that they were facing toward me, not away. I now really felt like I was somewhere that I wasn't supposed to be, only this time instead of giddiness, I felt nauseous. As if I were a deer and they a hunter, I turned and bolted. I flew through those trees, still bent to avoid collision. I didn't look down this time, stumbling as fast as I could, only focused on the light at the end of the trees. I felt the branches pull at my hair and clothing as I ran. I couldn't hear anything over my own breathing. As soon as I broke the tree line, I felt a weight lift. The group standing at the fence looked startled by me bursting out of the forest. I told them that I thought I had seen someone, but it almost felt wrong to talk about it. We left soon after. I have no idea what it was. Was it a person hanging out deep in the forest? Was it a fae, a spirit, the green man? All I know is that it felt otherworldly. During the past few years, my gifts of clairvoyancy have developed further, which has created some moments where I truly have questioned my sanity. Former teachers of mine have communicated to me from beyond their grave. 2 of them have led me to where they are buried, and I have predicted 3 district deaths. The first teacher to come through was actually a nurse from the local school, followed by my 6th grade social studies teacher. I was aware that the nurse had passed away in 2012, so I wasn't surprised when she came through. However, I was unaware of the second one passing, and immediately went into denial mode. Eventually, through clues via dreams and meditation, I was able to locate her final resting place. I went from being in denial to being absolutely speechless. I followed the clues that she gave me, and there I was, at her grave. It was at that moment that I realized that what I was dealing with was reality, and that I was not losing my mind. The creepy thing is the numbers of her plot are the same as the numbers in the school district where she taught. As I was visiting her on March 1st, 2017, I had a flash or image prediction about another former teacher passing away, and they would be buried in the same cemetery. On March 6th, another one of my 6th grade teachers passed away, and a few days later they were buried in the same cemetery. The process repeated itself, and he led me to where he is buried. That isn't the only death or dreams, visions that I've had. I've had 2 others. One was in December of 2016, hours after the teacher passed away, and one was in June 2017, 6 months prior to her passing. There seems to be no time structure when it comes to dreams or visions, and the time of passing itself. It ranges in hours after to 6 months before. A couple of months ago I had another dream, and while nothing has happened as of yet, I am very concerned. In 1999, I moved back to Washington State after traveling around the country for 4 years. My grandmother let me move in with her for a while so that I could get back on my feet. I hated the basement of her house. Always have. But it was free rent, and she was cool with Chuck, my 90-pound black lab. Plus, my Gramps and I got along pretty well. Late one night, about 3 months into me staying there, I woke up because Chuck kept moving around on the bed and was shaking the mattress. Then I heard him start grumping. You know, those grumpy groans that old dogs make when you scratch behind their ears and they love it. He started doing that. Once I realized what I was hearing, I sat up to yell at him to go back to sleep. That's when I discovered the reason that he was moving around so much. He was trying to get closer to the woman who was standing right next to my bed, scratching him behind the ear. I didn't scream, and I'm proud of that. But also, what the actual hell? Where did she come from? Who was she? Why was she standing in my room petting my dog at 3 a.m.? I was too afraid to ask. I did the only thing I knew how to in those situations. I hid under the blanket. Certainly she would be gone by the time I re-emerged from underneath it. That's how these things are supposed to work, right? I waited for a little while, but when I came out from under the blanket, she was still there. So I hid under there again, 3 more times. Every time I came back out, she would still be there, smiling at me and scratching my dog's ears. The last time I was under the covers, I realized that I wasn't actually afraid of the woman. Chuck and I met under stressful situations for both of us, and because of that, he and I had a super strong bond. I trusted him implicitly. If she had meant me harm, he would have reacted to her negatively. But his reaction was clearly positive, so I figured that she probably wasn't there to kill me. So I came out from under the blanket one last time, intending to deal with the freaky woman still standing right next to me. Somehow I had decided that by turning on the light, it would make her disappear. I reached over and snapped on the bedside lamp. I don't know why I thought that would work. Is that even a thing? Are ghosts supposed to disappear in the light? Well, I turned it on and she didn't, so I don't think it's a real thing. By then, she had been standing at my bedside petting Chuck for several minutes, and I was out of ghost-busting options, so I gave up on being terrified and just looked at her. Really looked at her. I can still see her right now in my mind, dressed up in a classy brown pantsuit with a cream-colored blouse. She had shoulder-length auburn hair styled beautifully with these big loopy curls. She looked like she had been on her way to work a party, and she had only stopped for a second to say hello. She was very pretty. She looked happy. I didn't have the nerve to talk to her, or at least I don't remember speaking, but I stayed present, and we both looked at each other for quite a while. I remember having the distinct impression of her knowing that I was there, of both of us being aware of the other. Then she stopped petting Chuck and walked to the end of my bed, stood up straight and proud, and dissolved away. I mean that very literally. First her clothes, then her skin, her organs, and her bones. Like that Nazi at the end of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. I remember what her blood looked like as it dissolved to reveal her skeleton. That should be a gross and terrifying memory, but I don't recall it like that. At the time, it felt like she was doing it on purpose. Like she had wanted to make the most dramatic exit that she could manage. I remember thinking, this should scare the pants off of me, but also, wow. Somehow, I did go back to sleep. In the morning, over coffee, I was going to tell my grandmother about what had happened, but she had just received an upsetting phone call. Apparently, her best friend from high school, Ursula, had passed away in the middle of the night. I'd heard stories about their teenage shenanigans, especially the one about the stolen birthday cake. But I never saw a picture of Ursula, so I asked what she looked like. I couldn't tell you what she looked like these days, but when she was young, she had the most beautiful curly auburn hair, is what my grandmother said. That's not the only weird thing that happened in my grandmother's basement, but it does remain the most vivid, without a doubt. I do believe in the paranormal. Not routinely and not as an explanation for everything, but I definitely believe that some things just can't be logically explained. I've dabbled in divination for the past couple years, which has led me to notice more universal symbolism and omens. Recently, I've seen some weird ones. I was driving around my area the other day and passed a funeral procession twice. It struck me as sort of unsettling and out of the ordinary. I drive around a lot, and I don't usually see funeral processions around just randomly. I was a little bit anxious by it, especially so when I passed the hearse itself, but I pretty much brushed it off. That same day, I was pulling into a drive-thru at around 3 a.m., and a black cat came out of seemingly nowhere. It strolled in front of the car and continued walking into nothing. It felt very rare to see, since I live in a well-populated suburb that doesn't usually have animals roaming about. This morning, there was a black cat watching my window on the windowsill of the house across from mine. As I looked at the cat, it began to thunderstorm. I know it all sounds really small and maybe a touch overzealous, but I couldn't help but feeling odd about these things because of how out of the ordinary that they felt, and silently spooky. Not to mention, all happening in the same couple of days. The closeness of it all made me curious, and I had to look into it, just to see if these things were things that other people believed to be bad omens. In my very unofficial research, I have found that 1. passing a funeral can be bad luck and can, quote-unquote, hasten your own death. 2. In European folklore, a black cat crossing your path can be unlucky and lead to misfortune and death. Occasionally, however, they can represent good luck, but from what I've found, it's fairly situational. And 3. In Greek mythology, thunder could represent punishment to the humans by the gods, associated with Zeus. Clearly, death is kind of a theme here. All of this just doesn't sit well with me, and it's accompanied by a generally strange feeling that I've noticed prevailing in my mood lately. Something just feels off, you know? Me and my friends went into the forest that's in my backyard. We went at least 5 minutes deep into the woods, down to a stream. We looked across the stream and saw a log, or at least what we thought was a log. It might have been, but one of us pointed out that it seemed to have turned its head. We ran as fast as we could back out of there. This was during a sleepover. We went to sleep around 3, but I ended up waking up around 4 after hearing a noise. I saw a shadowy figure that immediately disappeared once I laid eyes on it. I haven't seen anything else since. It could have just been my imagination, but I could have sworn that I did in fact see it. And it had the same outline as what we saw from a distance earlier that afternoon. My friends and I told me that I was just being paranoid, but I don't think I was. So I checked it out again in the same place, and the log figure was gone. So I still feel as if that thing were not after me, but after one of my friends. 2 years later, and still, I haven't heard or seen anything of it. Although every now and then, I do get the feeling that I'm being watched. I've been getting a little less sleep, but I think that might just be the fact that my sleep schedule is trying to adjust, but I still don't know what that thing is, and whether or not it was real, or if it was just part of my mind playing tricks on me. But again, I don't think that that was it. Remember when I said I hadn't seen anything of it since? Well, I lied. The other day I went back into the forest, and there it was, in the same position that me and my friends had seen it in 2 years ago. I brought them over there, and they confirmed that they were seeing the same thing. It did not look over this time, but I've had an uneasy feeling ever since. They started to stop with the feeling 1 year afterward, but when I saw it a few days ago, the uneasy feeling increased. I don't know what it is, or what it wants, but I don't like it. It's not anything I've seen in any paranormal YouTube videos or anything else about the paranormal, which leads me back to believing that it wasn't real. But my friends confirmed that it was real, and I'm not questioning what they said. So it was real, and it was scary. I hope the uneasy feeling goes down soon, and if the thing ever comes near my house again, I'm going to call the police. Oh, and I forgot to mention that the morning after the sleepover, I saw not footprints, but something else that I can't quite put my finger on. Something that no human foot could ever have made. I have no idea what it was, and don't plan on trying to figure it out. Yesterday, I took the day off of work to do a bunch of chores around the house, so I was home alone. One of the things I had to do was turn in our old cable equipment and DSL router, get new equipment, and install it. My house was built in the early 1950s, that is, the upstairs part. We have a downstairs part that's a new addition built sometime in the early 2000s. I only mention this so that you can understand that the upstairs of the house is a raised foundation with wooden floors throughout. The new addition is downstairs on concrete foundation. Upstairs, you can hear the footsteps of someone walking around with shoes on their feet. Downstairs it's a little harder to hear because there's carpeting and it's on concrete, so if someone was running across the house on the upstairs older part, it's loud and echoey. Yesterday, as I said, I was home alone. It was early in the afternoon. I was downstairs installing the new router on the very far corner of the downstairs part of the house. As I was laying on the floor trying to locate the cables and put them in the right places, I heard loud running coming from the upstairs in the older part of the house. It's not possible that someone had come in and then left, because all the doors and windows have sensors that make a chime when a door or window is open. I did not hear a chime, and no one who lived in the house should have been home. My wife was at work, and my son was at school. I quickly got up and did my best to listen to see if there really was someone in the house. I went to check and looked through each bedroom, through the kitchen, through the bathrooms. The front door was locked, and there's no way that anyone could have entered the house or run through it and left, as I said. I don't know what I heard, but it was definitely heavy footsteps, even though it was empty. I'm going to tell about my experience, but for certain reasons I will not be naming anyone specifically. It was 2014. I was 13 years old at the time, and my great-grandmother was in a nursing home as her mental health had started to slip and as my great-aunt and uncle couldn't take care of her anymore. I remember the last time that I had seen her in person. It was a sunny January afternoon, and me, my parents, grandparents, and my aunt and uncle had decided to talk outside as opposed to the sad, depressing clinical interior of the nursing home. Despite my great-grandmother having memory issues, she recognized me right away and told me specifically hello. It's March of 2014, and during the night, I'm having memory flashbacks of things that me and my great-grandmother used to do, like stringing long strands of old-fashioned buttons, or the time I had my first ever garden-grown tomato raw, sitting on the porch swing with her while my grandfather worked in the field. I remember waking up that morning and asking, almost demanding my mother to call the nursing home, or my great-aunt and uncle, and she called them while I took a shower. After I got done, my mother informed me that my grandmother had indeed passed away from old age. I spent the rest of the day walking around our house in an almost trance-like state. I'm a 14-year-old girl, but when I moved into this house, I had just turned 12. The house was fine, and was very quiet since before this I had lived with a ton of family, but now there were only 4 of us. We moved in the day after Thanksgiving, and it felt great to have my own room that I didn't have to share with any cousins or siblings, so I spent a lot of time up there basking in my newfound alone space. Let me emphasize this. When we moved in, I felt nothing. No presence, no spirits, nothing paranormal, nothing off. That is, until December rolled around. The first week of December is when I felt it for the first time, like I was being watched by something. Like when someone stares at you in public, and you have that instinct to look at them, that's how it felt. I always felt watched in my room, to the point that I hated being alone up there, and spent all my time in the living room or in my parents' or brother's room. The first week goes by, and I try to ignore the feeling. I chalked it up to me being paranoid because it was a new house, but still, the thoughts stayed in the back of my mind. Finally, I told someone who may have answers for me, my aunt. She's my mom's sister, and she has always believed in the paranormal for as long as I can remember. She got me into it for a while before I stopped believing. I believe again now, because this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. She explained that it was probably a nice spirit watching over the house and, hopefully, me. I hoped that was the case, and in a way, it was. Over time, I would feel it any time I entered my room, and especially when I was trying to fall asleep. It creeped me out so much, and I just wished that it would go away. Then it went from watching me to making contact. One night I was home alone because my brother and parents were visiting Santa, and I didn't want to go that year because I felt sick. I was in the kitchen making hot chocolate when I felt breathing on the back of my neck. It was hot and made my hair stand up. I froze in fear and stood there until the microwave went off. When it began to beep, the breathing faded away as if whatever were there had just walked off. I made the hot chocolate and sat on the couch. I was so freaked out that I was just there staring at the TV in shock until my family got home. Worst part is that I could still feel something staring at me, and this time, it wasn't in my room. Finally, the week of Christmas came, and the excitement made me forget about the incident prior until it happened again. Me and my mom were hanging out in the kitchen when she turned around to answer a question that my brother had asked her. I felt the hot breathing on my neck, and this time it stayed there longer. I froze again, unsure of what to do. I panicked and got up and went over by my mom, who was very confused. After that, I felt the breathing constantly, even on Christmas while opening gifts. It lingered. I finally got fed up one day while sitting in my room. It became less scary and more annoying. I said something along the lines of, "Stop breathing on me," and it stopped completely, and I was shocked. I didn't think it would actually work. After that, I began to have the same dream, but slightly different, every single night. It would begin with me at some park that I've never seen in my life, and me and this boy sat on a bench together. We would begin to talk, and it was actually quite peaceful. We would just converse and stare around at the people walking by. He had brown hair and brown eyes, and was really tall compared to me. I'm about 5'4", and he was like 6 feet. The dream would end, and I would never remember anything we talked about, just that it was a good dream. Flash forward to right after Christmas break, a friend, let's call her Danielle, came over to spend the night. We both heavily believed in the paranormal, and she decided because of this whole watching and breathing thing that she would bring her Ouija board. I had always heard different things about them, but decided it was worth a try. We began talking to the thing that watched me, and the reason I knew this is because it always had this very specific energy. I knew it because, like I've said this whole time, he was up my butt. We first asked what his name was, and he replied, Nolan. I was pretty shocked that the board actually worked, and I was pretty mesmerized. I then asked if he was the boy that I talked to in my dreams, and again, he said yes. I was pretty happy that he was nice, because before, I was quite terrified that he was a demon that wanted to eat my bones, but was relieved when it was just a 15-year-old boy. He then said he doesn't like summer and prefers winter, which explains the only appearance being during winter months. Cut to next December, the watching and breathing had stopped during March through November until it began again, only this time stronger. He began screwing with me. He would open cupboards that I had just closed, or move things that I put in specific areas, only to find them in strange places far from their original area. I always knew that this was Nolan, who I had begun to call Noel. Time went on and the dreams became more vivid, and I remembered the conversations that we had, and it was still nice. Nolan became a good friend, even though I couldn't see him. That December came and went, and now we cut to this year. This is where I wish that Nolan never existed. So because of financial issues and other problems, my dad's family had to move in, my grandparents, aunt, and cousin. And me and that cousin were never super close. I'll call him Connor. Connor was super annoying. He always made messes that he never cleaned up. He never did chores, never did or went to school, and would do stupid stuff for attention, yet he always got what he wanted. By now, I'm 14 and Connor is 12. December rolls around and I'm excited to talk to Nolan. Me and Danielle are still friends and do weekend Ouija sessions with him. So we're home alone, me, Connor, and Danielle, and we decide to introduce Connor to Nolan. So we set up the candles and everything and begin. Things are going smoothly, until Connor starts calling Nolan names. He was saying some pretty mean stuff, too. Me and Danielle were trying to get him to stop, but nothing was working until Nolan got really, really mad. Doors began slamming open and shut. Cupboards were going nuts. Our TV was flickering channels, and the windows sounded like someone was beating on them. Finally, I looked into the doorway to the hall, where everyone's rooms were besides mine, and there was a tall figure standing there, not moving, as everything went haywire. I screamed and said goodbye, standing up. Danielle was yelling for Nolan to stop, and Connor had begun to cry. Finally, I screamed for him to stop, that he was scaring me, and the figure disappeared, and the cupboards shut along with the doors. The banging stopped, and I just sat on the floor sobbing. Danielle wasn't crying, but I was terrified and just stood there silently. Connor didn't say anything either, but continued staring at the floor with tears in his eyes. Finally, our parents got home, and me and Danielle went to my room while Connor went back to the basement where he stayed with my aunt and grandpa. Danielle had fallen asleep, but I couldn't, so I began talking out loud as I felt Nolan was in the room. I started saying how it wasn't okay, that he had really scared me, and I felt the breathing on my neck. Finally, I fell asleep, and things were fine. I dreamt about him again, and all was normal. About a week after that, Connor wanted to talk to Nolan again. Apparently, Nolan was giving him nightmares, ones where he was chasing him throughout our house, trying to kill him. Nolan would scream about how Connor needed to leave me alone and stop bothering me, or he would kill him. Connor was obviously terrified, and wanted to say sorry, I guess. I'm not sure, but me and him sat down with Danielle's board, which she had left the week prior, and we began to talk with him. Nolan kept spelling out things like murder, angry, and my name over and over again. Our candles went out and knocking began on the window behind me. It went very slow at first, just a simple knock, knock, knock. Me and Connor froze. I couldn't move and I didn't want to turn around. Finally, I told Nolan that I was scared and that he needed to leave Connor alone and stop. The knocking stopped, and the board spelled out, sorry, then, Connor bad. After that, Connor decided to call it quits and go to bed. I decided to go into my room and try to talk to Nolan again. I started by being nice and asking him to knock once for yes, two for no, something that we usually did. But he got angry fast. He started to bang on my walls at the mention of Connor. My lights went out, and so did my TV. The banging was loud, and if I'm honest, it was terrifying. He was throwing my pillows and banging on my windows, like the night that Danielle was here. I was crying so hard that I could barely breathe and was hyperventilating and sobbing so hard that I could barely talk. Nolan stopped after I let out a strangled cry for him to leave me alone. After that, he stayed away, for a day at least. The next day I woke up, and the Ouija board sat in the middle of my room. I kicked it hard and walked downstairs. I was eating at the kitchen table talking to Connor about the night before. He said he had another dream about Nolan, except it wasn't a nightmare. It was exactly like mine in the park. They talked. I'm still confused about why Nolan would do this. I felt breathing on my neck while eating and basically told Nolan to screw off. I was still mad at him from last night. He did pretty quickly. I didn't feel him for a while, until last night, when Danielle came over for a sleepover and I decided to talk to Nolan. He obviously wanted to talk, so he sat up in my room, and he came through faster than I've ever seen. Now what happened next is what I really need some answers for. We began talking and he spelt out sorry, but then he did something I've never seen him do. He spelt out love, and I honestly don't know what that means. He would emphasize it, and barely answer any questions after that. Danielle then made the mistake of bringing up Connor. Nolan got pretty mad, and started to bang on the walls again. I yelled at him to stop, and he did. I didn't say anything after that. Today I called my aunt for advice. She said he may just be an overprotective spirit, but I'm not sure if that's the case here. I don't know if Nolan is bad or not. He isn't to me, but he is to Connor and sometimes even Danielle, but never to me. All I know is that I won't be talking to Nolan for a while, a really long while. And even now, while typing this out, I can feel his breath on the back of my neck. Unfortunately, my dad died earlier this year, and the way he died was terrible, in which my whole family has to go to therapy. Yet, I still miss him and love him always. To get into the experience, I've moved around a lot this year due to personal problems since my dad's passing. I also got 2 puppies this year from the same litter. Lost my dad and dog on the same day. Kinda like a replacement for the 2 loved ones that I did lose. One of the dogs was quiet and usually pretty chill, except that he had these moments where he would start staring at a wall or something in the room randomly, when he wouldn't normally do this. I know that dogs have a 6th sense about paranormal stuff, as well as cats and other animals. This behavior would happen about each month, around 2 to 3 times since I got him in May. Then I moved again to my godfather's house, which he's my dad's older brother. There are still some tense feelings here and there because it's a very sensitive topic for my godparents and dad's side of the family to talk about my dad, or even to see videos or pictures of him. Around the same time I started my new job, where it would require me waking up at 2, 3, sometimes 4 in the morning to leave for work. In front of my room, there would be like a tiny light that's usually on sometimes when people forget to turn it off. There's nothing in the way of that light that could ever cause a shadow. One day I was leaving for work. It was about a week ago. I go to get my shoes, and I'm about to leave through the front door when I look up, and in front of the light, there is a shadow of a person. I immediately recognized who it was. It was my dad. The only reason I know him is because of his shoulders and height. I looked and saw his big shoulders and his head. I blinked, and then it went away. I closed the door to the house and went to my car. Until about 10 minutes later, it hit me again that I had just seen my father. I think I cried about it after work, but I couldn't tell anyone for fear of them thinking that I've lost my mind. I was wondering if anyone could offer their thoughts, or an explanation on a paranormal experience that I had as a child. When I was 11, my younger sister passed away from a very sudden death. Months before this incident, I had a vision in the middle of the night that I had never made sense of until recently. I had woken up and saw a floating orb of white light in my room. Inside of it was a young child, around 4, maybe 5 years old, the same age as my late sister, with short hair, wearing a Victorian-style nightgown. I came close to it and stared at it for a minute or 2, and then went back to sleep. The next day, I was filled with overwhelming anxiety and the feeling of someone's presence in the house. Only years after this vision and the death of my sister have I thought that this could possibly be some sort of omen or warning of her death. I live in a rural but not isolated area in the Midwest. My window is right up against the forest, which is about 50 or 60 feet away from the tree line, about 20 or so feet above ground level. I heard what I am convinced was a low, echoing humming like a song from the woods. I've heard turkey, coyote, fox, deer, squirrel, and so on before, their cries, calls, and barks. This was none of those. As I laid there in bed, as I began to concentrate on the sound, I couldn't shake the mental conclusion of, it's a woman singing. The sound persisted for about 15 to 20 seconds and then stopped, but not suddenly. After a minute or two later, it picked back up again. This continued a few more times before it actually did stop completely. The sound was distant, not quite deep into the woods, but also not at the tree line. There's a small unit of deer that sometimes sleep in a clearing in the woods around that area, but they haven't been there in a few weeks. For some context, I am very much a late-night person. I used to work graveyard shifts due to my ability to stay alert so long into the night. This is how I know what all these common and uncommon woodland creatures sound like. And no, I did not look outside of my window. My process was this: if I can't identify it, don't look for it. I still think I was right to not seek out an immediate answer. Additionally, the song was clear. A few years ago, I was still in high school, and out of my own curiosity, I tried to lucid dream. I started recording dreams for a month as soon as I woke up. I had all of them written out on a big notepad, but I never really got it to work. Anyway, one night I had a dream where a friend came to me right before I woke up, and the only thing that happened was him telling me something bad is gonna happen soon. A few days later, I completely forgot about this, but the same friend in real life keeps acting really just down in the dumps. I ask him what's wrong, and he said it's just a bummer because his uncle had a heart attack and he's worried about him. To add to it, I get a call later that day telling me that my uncle also had a heart attack on the same day and died. At that point, I had to break this weird story to him. Premonition, or just pretty creepy coincidence? He believes the story, even though I would have been skeptical. In high school, my friends and I knew a guy named Gene. For whatever reason, Gene had a habit of telling extremely tall tales centered on himself, as if he were trying to make himself look cooler. The most repeated one was his claim that in a nearby ravine, a coven of druids practiced and were schooling him in ancient magic. He always played them straight, as if they were unquestionably true. He never had any evidence. While taking a walk one night, I happened upon a construction site. Being heavily into urban exploration, I explored the heck out of that site, and upon leaving, tipped over their porta potty. I was still a bit immature, and I thought it was funny. After that, whenever I found one, over it went. One day I told some friends about it, and Gene, ever the showman, chimed in with, "Oh, that's nothing. I like to burn them down." Arson was most assuredly not our thing, and we knew that Gene was full of it, so we were just surprised when, calling his bluff, he offered to prove it by showing us the fruits of his labors. 5 of us piled into the car, only one of us had a car, and followed Gene's instructions. The site was in a rural area with lots of big hills and dense forest, common in the Pacific Northwest. At a sharp elbow on a 2-lane road was a gravel turnoff leading maybe 100 feet into the woods to a gravel parking lot. This was the starting point for a number of hiking trails. There were no lights there, and the street light out on the road didn't show very much through the trees. Also, there were no other cars. One of the trails began past a gate that was designed to keep off-roaders from the trails, and it took a sharp left turn from the back of the parking lot. The porta-potty had been about 30 feet or so up the trail, and on a later visit by day, we found out that Gene really did burn it into a puddle of blue goo. That night, we didn't make it there. We had a couple of flashlights, and we all started up the trail as a group. As far as I can recall, we never heard any noises, animal or human. We got about halfway to the spot, then all of us stopped walking. Someone whispered, "Do you feel that?" and we all bolted down the trail, piled back into the car, and got the hell out of there. Once on the road, we compared thoughts. I felt what everyone else did. The deepest, most intense, raw fear that I have ever endured. It was like we suddenly faced impending death. It clearly indicated I need to leave right this instant. I can only guess that there might have been a cougar or something, as they've been known to attack hikers, but we saw and heard absolutely nothing. I've read that if a little voice in your head tells you to do something, it's a good idea to listen. Part of me wonders if Jean's porta-potty fire pissed off some forest spirit or something. I've been back to that trailhead a few times during the day to show friends where this happened. I've also brought a friend who's quote-unquote sensitive, as they say, and they didn't pick up anything. I've had a few odd experiences, including seeing a couple of ghosts, some strange lights in the sky several times, and some other stuff. This is the only unexplainable experience that I've had which was deeply scary. When I was growing up, there had been a few forests around town that had famous stories linked to them. The people believed that the forests were cursed from the Native American tribes who were relocated from their homes way back when. They said that the forests belonged to them, and when you go in and ignore your gut feeling, those people die in those woods. When my dad and my sister and I moved when I was around 13 or so, we moved to a small town. Across the street was a hill, and at the top stood a blue water tower. I used to hang out in the woods across the street from my house. It was quiet, and the birds always chirped. Other kids were scared of the woods, but I went up there to draw and listen to the birds. Also, because it was at the top of a hill, I could look out and see the entire town and feel the breeze. But when the animals went quiet, it was time to go. When the school year started, I found out that it was an ancient Indian burial ground. Every year our class would go up the hill and learn about it, and the town and the school was actually really respectful of the forest and the hill. We took care of the trees there. If you looked at the ground, you could still see a lot of Native American arrowheads. We never took them home, though, and were not supposed to. I didn't, at least. I would actually go into the forest when I was walking home because the bullies were too scared to go in. I felt safe there, but I also had to remember to respect it. In the forest, we also had wood piles. When we would go into the forest, we would make piles for the local foxes to nest in during the winter time. Once I went to school after retreating into the forest from one of my bullies the other day. A couple of my classmates ran up to me and said, "What did you do, Jacob?" I looked at the kid and said, "Nothing, why?" They looked at each other and said, "Well, something scared him, and we thought you had scared him in the woods." I said, "I didn't scare him, I just went in there to hang out." It was the time that Jacob threw a rock at me, and I remember it landed to my right, and I hurried up my pace in the woods, and I thought that he had left at that point, like he always did. He screamed raccoon at me, and when I reached the top of the hill, I cried and went home because for some reason that time the bullying hurt. Whatever happened to Jacob in the woods, I'll never know. He stopped bullying me from that day forward and said sorry to me and that it would never happen again. He did say something happened in the woods, but he never said by what or who. Just had a look of terror and practically begged me to accept his apology. I told him it's all right and I went on my way. He could never look me in the eye again. That was back in middle school. When I went to college, I saw him at a 4th of July college event. I was going to catch up with him about life and put the bullying behind us. He glanced, but still looked so uneasy that I simply walked by. Also, sometimes my sister would walk home with me after school. only once or twice that I can recall. Every time we entered the woods, she felt lost. I even had her lead us, and she couldn't follow the trail. It's like she kept seeing these invisible trails that went in circles. She started to breathe heavy and cry and said we were lost, and she had an anxiety attack and just told me that we had to get out of the woods. I was totally chill, and knew the forest pretty well, and I let us out, and it was easy. It was literally just 3 trails, one from the south, one from the north, and one going up the hill to our house. You could get in and out of the forest in under 10 minutes, from one side to the other. For a little background, my mother has been in a long-term nursing facility since March, with some serious but stable health issues. Then there was a virus outbreak in her facility, and she was diagnosed with it. I of course worried for her condition as she began to decline rather quickly over the beginning of last week. Last Wednesday, I switched off my light at 10 p.m. like most nights, rolled over, and began to doze off. Typically when I'm dozing, my mind will follow some random train of thought that will lead me off into snooze land. That night, as I was dozing, I envisioned my mother walking into my late father's arms, being hugged by my older brother who had died 9 years ago, and having my grandparents and aunt gather around her while being hugged by my father. Then the phone woke me up at 10:30 p.m. The hospice nurse called to tell me that my mother had passed away at 10:15. I like to think that I was seeing her entry into heaven, with my family's love and long-missed affection return to bring her to happiness. Recently I moved into a new house. 2 close friends, let's call them E and R, moved in along with me. When we went to view the house, nothing seemed off about it. However, about a week in, we screwed up. E had been cleaning out the attic and came across a wooden box. It looked fairly new and we didn't think anything could ever go wrong with it. E and I looked inside the box. All that was there was 4 candles, an old matchbox with no matches, and a small wooden doll. E and I set it aside, not interested. We ended up putting it back in the attic, apart from the doll, which R wanted to put in her potted plant. We proceeded with our sorting and forgot all about the box. That night, when I went to bed, I felt as if I were being watched. It was unnerving, but I eventually fell asleep. A few hours later, I heard something bang against the floor above me. I would have brushed it off as E, as his room was up there, if what had happened next didn't take place. For a bit of background knowledge, in September of 2017, R was in a car crash. The others were fine, but R ended up in a wheelchair. R called out for me. It wasn't calm as it usually was, but frantic. I moved into her room, and she asked me if I had heard the crash. I told her I had and thought that it was just E. She looked me dead in the eye and told me that E was working a night shift. It was unlike her to be so flustered, so I offered to stay with her, which she accepted. Soon after, we began to hear light footsteps and giggles outside R's room. We were scared, but continued to try and tune it out. R fell asleep, but I stayed with her, scared shitless by possible ghost children. Eventually, the stupid undead kids stopped running up and down the halls, so I assumed they left. I was then able to fall into a well-deserved slumber. Then, maybe an hour or so later, E got back from work. I know this because he is incapable of entering anywhere quietly. And then he screamed, like a grown man screaming as if he were a little girl. He ran up the stairs into my room and then out of my room because I was with R, and then he ran into R's room. He then told us what had happened. Apparently, he'd been putting his work bag down and felt as if he were being watched. He looked up and for a split second saw a little boy and girl holding hands. Now, normally I wouldn't have believed anything like this, but he is an honest bloke, and I saw the look of terror on his face. I have not been able to stop thinking about this experience since it happened about 10 years ago. I have never felt anything like it. Myself and 2 friends went for a walk in our local forest. I tend to walk fast, so I had walked on ahead of them. I got to a certain part of the forest, and literally from nowhere, I was struck with the most overwhelming feeling of terror. It was so strong that it literally stopped me mid-stride. I froze and could not move. I was petrified. There was nothing and nobody else around. Then I get what can only be described as a certainty in my head. It couldn't be accurate to call it a voice, rather an overwhelmingly strong sense of knowing that I needed to look to my left. I did so. There was still no one and nothing there, except for a big crack in the side of the rock face that basically made for a small cave. Whatever it was, I knew that it was in that cave, but physically there was nothing to be seen. I am not easily freaked out. I cannot impress on you enough how utterly terrified that I was in that moment. And this was the middle of the afternoon. Had the next part not happened, I could have dismissed this and thought little of it. But it did happen. As I stood there unable to move, one of my friends walks nonchalantly around the corner and immediately, without me even having a chance to look at her try to move, she stops dead in her tracks and says, "Whoa, bad energy off that cave." I try to stumble out some explanation of how I am feeling, but I can't. My brain was literally scrambled by fear. A minute later, our male friend appears. Both of us women start trying to explain to him what was happening, because he felt nothing. He approached the cave to look in, and we 2 grown-ass women are begging him not to get too close to it. I was actually on the verge of tears. But again, he felt absolutely nothing. He took a long look inside and reckoned that we were both just being a bit hysterical. It was the weirdest thing. Whatever was in there was just gone in an instant the second that he appeared. I've always had an uncanny knowing that whatever it was did not intend to harm us. It just wanted us to know that we needed to walk the F away from that area, and that it was willing to harm us if it needed to. Oddly, I have such a clear image in my head of the spot where this happened, and I know that forest like the back of my hand. Over the past 10 years, I have looked for that cave and that rock face many times. I have never been able to find it again. I have been fascinated by ghosts and the supernatural my entire life. I've had a few experiences here and there, but this one in particular was the most significant and frightening. First, some background. My dad's side of the family is Native American, and some have a deep suspicion of owls. They're considered evil omens. Anyways, my grandmother was very, very attuned to spirits. She had the so-called second sight. She had a whole wealth of stories about her encounters with the paranormal, who she passed on to my aunt. But anywho, this next bit is relevant. A few months before she passed away from lupus, she woke up in a panic and came running into my aunt's room. My grandmother was generally a stoic, unflappable woman, so this was not like her. She dragged my aunt into her bedroom asking if she heard it. My aunt heard nothing. What my grandmother had heard was the so-called death owl. She passed on not too long after that. Fast forward about 10 years or so, I'm up around 4 a.m. watching TV. As I recall, it was around December of 2008. I heard this noise outside. It sounded like a woman weeping. The best way I can describe it was a voice that was caught between an owl's cry and a human's. It was very unnatural. I got a cold feeling in my gut because I knew exactly what it was, and it scared the ever-loving crap out of me. I remember being paralyzed with fear. I grew up out in the country, and I know what an owl sounds like. I've also heard bobcats, foxes, and the dying screams of rabbits. This was none of those things. Others have tried to claim that it was just an animal, but it was like no other animal I've ever heard. That unearthly wailing noise, like it was in mourning. It was the kind of sound that freezes the blood in your veins. At the time, I thought it might be foretelling my father's imminent death, since if you hear it, it either means that you or a family member is going to die, or it predicts great disaster. And for clarification, at the time, my dad was having some significant heart trouble, but he's much better now. Now comes the twist. On April 9th, 2009, a huge wildfire swept through my area. A lot of houses burned down, and mine was among them. When we came back, my home was nothing but a pile of smoking rubble. It took me a bit to make the connection, but I am positive that the death owl, or banshee, was an omen that predicted this disaster. One thing's for sure, I hope to God that I never hear that thing again, because I will never forget it. I have a suspicion that this thing stalks my family. I can't be certain. I'll have to do some research into my family tree. I know this might sound unbelievable to some, but I swear till the day that I die that this is all 100% true. So there you have it, folks. My most significant paranormal encounter. This happened around 13 years ago when I was a sophomore in college, attending a liberal arts school in Suffolk County, New York. Within the first month or two of freshman year, I had found myself in a very tight-knit group of fellow theater geeks. 6 guys, myself included, and 1 girl. And they all loved horror movies and ghost stories. I had found my crew. Freshman year was tough, but we all held each other up and made the whole experience more enjoyable for one another. At the beginning of sophomore year, we decided that in October, as the Halloween season was ramping up, we would find a creepy, wooded spot in a nearby town some night and scare the crap out of ourselves. We did some research and found that there was a particularly isolated area about 30 minutes away, infamous for paranormal sightings. Perfect. The 7 of us split into 2 different cars and headed out into the night. Allow me to set the scene. You turn off of a very busy main road, flooded with strip malls and restaurants and whatnot, and you're almost immediately greeted by complete darkness. Again, this area was very heavily wooded. It was essentially a large web of winding roads surrounded by trees. Very few streetlights and very few houses. Without a GPS or a good sense of direction, one could easily get lost in there. We all made sure to have fully charged phones and flashlights just in case, but the goal was to keep driving until we collectively decided to pull over and go exploring. So, per the directions, we made a left off of the main road, driving about 30 minutes or so into this dark network, picking directions at random, just getting intentionally lost. Our cars made a turn and, to our surprise, there was a huge log in front of us. We had reached a dead end of some kind, with nothing but trees beyond it. We all got out to see exactly what this was, stepped over the log, and noticed two narrow trails leading off in different directions. This seemed like as good a time as any to grab our flashlights and do some amateur ghost hunting. We flipped a coin and set off on the trail to the right. The trail was so narrow that we had to walk single file to avoid getting whacked by branches. For whatever reason, I ended up in the back. I'm usually pretty rational and level-headed, but I have to say, the further we went in, the more I was overcome with an uneasy feeling. I kept hearing sounds deep in the woods, unable to shake the sense that we were being watched. But I seemed to be the only one who heard these things, so I shrugged it off as my imagination. In any case, the whole point of us being there was to get scared. Not to mention the fact that we were 7 able-bodied college students. What would we come across that could take us down? We headed down this trail for about 20 minutes, and just when I thought it would never end, we came to a massive clearing. And I mean massive. It was a large, open field of unkempt grass. Comparable in scope to a golf course, but not nearly as well manicured. The trees surrounded the entire field, which was so large we could not see the end of it from where we were standing. I was so thrilled to get out of that narrow trail, but I don't think any of us were expecting to find an area so vast. One of us looked to the right and said, "Hey, check that out." We all turned and there was an old, dilapidated house several hundred yards away. The house was completely dark, with no cars or signs of anyone actually living there. We walked over and shined our flashlights at it, and sure enough, the windows and doors were all boarded up. I peered between the boards on one of the windows, and what I could see was an old white couch covered in plastic, but an otherwise empty room. Whoever used to live there, they were long gone. Because there was no way in, and because we all felt sufficiently creeped out by the house anyway, we all decided to walk closer to the trail we had come in from, have a seat in the field, and figure out where to go next. We walked back towards the narrow trail, but before we could sit, my friend Mark stopped what he was doing. His expression dropped, and he pointed. We all turned, and on a very far side of the field, directly across from where we had come in, we could see someone tall, lanky, and pale dancing among the trees. By dancing, I mean that it was skipping around, grabbing a tree, swinging around it, and then doing the same thing to another one. Basically kind of like a do-si-do type motion. The moon was so bright, and the woods were so dark, it actually took a second for us to really understand what we were looking at. Jay, the 6'4" skeptic of the group, wasn't seeing it. I leaned into him, pointed in that direction, and said, "Jay, look where I'm pointing. Don't you see that?" He squinted a bit, and the second that he did see it, he gasped with everything that he had, clutched my arm, and whispered, "What the fuck is that?" What happened next sent shockwaves through all of us. Whoever it was, they stopped dancing, looked in our direction, and started charging straight at us. Without even thinking, we freaked and ran back to the trail. Yet again, Jay was the only one who didn't see what was happening. He shouted after us, "Guys, what is it? Where are you going?" After about 15 seconds of running like hell, I heard Jay scream, "Holy shit!" I looked back and saw his flashlight following the rest of us into the trail. While the walk into the woods took about 20 minutes, we made it back to our 2 cars, hopped in, and were peeling away and closer to 5. Once we were at a safe distance, we pulled over, got out, and checked in with each other about what had just happened. My heart was pounding, and I knew everyone else was feeling the same way. Nearly 15 years later, we are all still friends, living in different states yet keeping in touch through marriages, divorce of children, etc. But occasionally, out of the blue, one of us will send a group text to the others, something to the effect of, "The woods. That really happened, right?" It most certainly did. That experience is always in the back of my mind, and I'm pretty sure it always will be. Here's the thing that still resonates with me about that night. Whoever that was, they were dancing maniacally in the woods at 1 in the morning, and then ran directly for a group of young adults, not at all fazed by the fact that they were severely outnumbered. Did that thing know we were there from the second we parked? Was it the sound that I kept hearing when we walked the trail? Whatever the case may be, when he came for us that night, you can be sure none of us wanted to stick around to see what he was truly capable of. This is my story from about 4 years ago. I was on a camping trip with some friends when we decided to go a little bit further into the forest to get the best location at the river. We had some beers and went swimming. When it started to get dark, almost all of my friends wanted to go home. Only my buddies Flo and Laura stayed with me. We lit a fire and continued to drink beer. After some hours, I felt like I had to go to the toilet. No problem, even had toilet paper in my backpack. Our camp was located right at the river, and a big field of high grass separated us from the forest. I decided to go to the high grass right in front of the trees, so I grabbed my phone as a flashlight and grabbed the toilet paper and went in the direction of the forest. It was pitch black, and because of the branches of the trees, I couldn't even see into the forest with my flashlight. So I sat down with my back to the forest and started doing my business. I was about 160 feet away from my friends now, and couldn't even hear them talking anymore. When I was almost finished, I heard a sound coming from behind me. It was like the rustle of dry leaves or the crackle of branches. I know it's the kind of horror movie stereotype. I stumbled and said, "Hello? Who's there?" 2 or 3 times, but no one answered. I thought it might be some kind of animal, so I screamed as loud as I could. But to my horror, this thing got even closer. I finished as fast as I could, which still felt like an hour to me, while the sound came closer and closer with each passing second. When I stood up and started running, the thing was so close that I expected it to grab me from behind as I tried to escape. So I ran as fast as I could, screaming and crying. When I arrived at our camp, I told my friends everything. They didn't really believe me, but they were pretty scared themselves. I was 17 at the time, big and muscular, and normally not the type of guy to cry. But this thing made me cry, and it would make me again. I could not sleep at all that night. I sat in my sleeping bag, the river to my back, while staring into the direction of the forest. There were no sounds or anything. Just the sound of the wind and darkness. In the morning we packed our stuff and made our way home. I won't go anywhere near that forest anymore. Jokes were often made about me, but I know what I heard, and I get the shivers right now just while writing this. In Germany we have no dangerous animals living in the forests, but every animal in our forest would avoid contact with humans, especially when you shout at them. I work in an Alzheimer's unit. Most of the residents don't stay around for very long because they're on hospice, so basically I barely get to know them, and before I know it, they've passed away. One resident we had did not have dementia, but schizophrenia. Her sister stuck her in there as more of a convenience for herself rather than considering her sister's mental health. The resident was extremely bright and remembered silly things that even I couldn't recall that had happened. Once COVID hit, she decided life wasn't worth living and that she would never get better. She starved herself to death. It was heartbreaking, and she suffered many delusions and manic episodes during her last days. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened the month following her passing, until the fire alarm went off out of nowhere during lunch. My coworker and I immediately went to guard the outside doors since they would unlock automatically once the fire alarm was triggered. We assumed it was another drill and were annoyed that it had happened at such a busy time of the day. On my way to the back door, I popped my head into each room just to make sure that everything was clear. When I came to that empty room, the minute that I opened the door, it was frigid. I assumed that it was normal since the room was empty and thought nothing more of it. I stood by the back door and waited for the alarm to stop. My boss came back with a concerned look on his face and told me that the alarm system said that it was coming from the room where that resident had just recently passed. I explained to him that that would be impossible because I had just checked and there was no sign of a fire. The alarm continued to go haywire for another 30 minutes, even when shut off. It was extremely bizarre. Afterward, I had asked out loud if it was our resident who had just passed, and it felt like a warm bucket of water was dumped over my head, and I couldn't resist the urge to cry. The kind of crying and sobbing that hurts your entire body. Sometimes she opens the fire extinguisher box to remind me that she's still around. You need a key and a strong arm to crank that box open. Anyway, I found it open again today after doing rounds, and was reminded of this experience. So much can happen in the forest. There are wild animals, possibly bad people, and the unknown itself. While hiking in Switzerland, I decided to see Matterhorn, the famous mountain, up close. As close as I could. So I left the village I was staying in early and walked through meadows, hills, and then up the mountains to reach the plateau. Early in the morning, after just leaving the town, I walked the straight path. Past some houses on the left, town behind, mountain ahead, and forest on the right. In front of the forest, there were a few curious old huts on long legs, ones that you climb up to by ladder. They were all made of round planks and black soot. My imagination immediately called them witch huts, relating them to movies and legends that I knew. They seemed closed, and I couldn't get into any of them, but I felt a slight shiver of excitement, and didn't really want to get in. So I kept on walking. I saw the mountain, met some people, had lunch, and in the afternoon decided to walk back to town. I remembered the way and backtracked pretty much exactly. On my way back, the mountain was behind me, the town ahead, houses and meadows on the right, and black spooky huts on the left, guiding the entrance, a path leading into the forest. I should note that despite checking out the huts in the morning, I didn't notice that there was a forest path starting behind them. Curious about it, I checked the wooden road signs placed in the vicinity of the huts. To my surprise, the one pointing into the woods said Zermatt, but the one pointing to where I originally came from in the morning said some other town's name. I was very confused. I looked back and looked again, thinking that maybe my brain was tricking me, but I kept seeing what I saw. I stood there while a few hikers passed in each direction. All stayed on the mountain path, nobody went into the forest or looked at the road signs. I sat there in front of the huts and smoked a cigarette. I debated whether or not I should go into the forest, why the signs showed such weird directions. I wondered if there was a reason I should go in. But I was already very tired to the point of my legs feeling weak. So I decided to go back the way I came, to trust my gut and take the most common main path back to town. When I stood up, the signs were different again. There was no way anyone could have rearranged them. No wind or human. I was there the whole time, and the only people who walked by didn't stop at the signs, let alone tinker with them. The one pointing into the forest said some other name, and the one pointing to my starting point said Zermatt like it should. I told this story to my friend in Zermatt, and he just laughed at the idea of paranormal entities trying to lure me into the forest. I did have a creepy feeling about the huts, but at the same time it was a beautiful day, and I still wonder whether there was some kind of adventure waiting for me if I took the forest path. What do you think? About 2 years ago, I visited the Auschwitz concentration camp with my parents. At one point, I separated from them because they are always slow while sightseeing. I entered the room that I later found out was used for torturing prisoners. Generally, throughout Auschwitz, I was feeling an overwhelming sadness, but I felt really strange in there. Sadness, helplessness, and apathy, all mixed together. Then I heard a woman's voice singing. I was alone, and there were no speakers. I left this room and immediately stopped hearing that voice. When I returned to the room, the singing started up again, and I was still alone. I stayed there feeling an overwhelming sadness still, until my mother joined me. Then the singing stopped altogether. Unfortunately, I don't recall what she was singing about, just that the song and the whole vibe of the place carried this incredible, intense melancholy. This is a story my grandma and grandpa told me a while back. I'm originally from a small town in Pennsylvania, and my grandfather was a state trooper for a majority of the time that he lived there before retirement. He took a course on hazardous waste removal. I can't remember his reasoning, but he was trained to be a guy in a hazmat suit who took toxic or irradiated waste away from certain locations. One night, while he and my Nana were asleep, he violently jolted straight up to a sitting position in his bed, still asleep. He pointed to a chair in the corner of his room and said to my Grams, who had been awoken by his movement, "Mary Lou, he's sitting right there in the chair. Do you see him?" My Nana was freaked out, so she tried to get him to lay back down in the bed, which took a few minutes, but eventually he was back to sleeping soundly. In the morning, my pop said that he saw death sitting in the chair in his room staring at him, and he took that as an omen that he was going to die very soon. About 2 months later, an incident at 3 Mile Island occurred, and the police force out there asked my pop's station to send all of his people there who had hazardous waste training to help get it cleaned up. My pop decided to take 2 weeks off and take a trip to Mexico with my mom and uncle because of the dream that he had had. And when he got back, many of the people that he had known at his office had some kind of radiation poisoning that eventually killed them. I don't tell it as well as they do, but I thought it was an interesting story. I am and always was connected to spirits in some way. I'm Native American, which does contribute to my sensitivity to otherworldly experiences. This particular experience happened about 7 years ago. Growing up, I was a weird kid. In middle school, I was in the paranormal/ghost hunter phase, watching anything that had to do with ghosts and hauntings that I could. Down the road from my house was a big and decrepit house, which always gave me and my friends really weird vibes, like something was watching us as we would walk past. One day, me, my sister, and my friend were looking on the App Store for an app to keep us busy, a new thing to do that wasn't like what we did on a normal day. We found this app that claimed to pick up EVPs. We take the app to the house to test it out, being kind of skeptical. We sat up on the driveway asking questions. As we asked questions, to our surprise, we got answers. The app told us that the spirit was an 8-year-old boy named Shane who had died in a fire. This made us flip out, running down the road to my mom. She dismissed it since it was a free app on the Apple Store after all, so we dismissed it as well. A few years later, I was in class with a friend from high school, and for some reason we started talking about ghosts and paranormal encounters. This friend had moved into the house down the road after the years of it being renovated and ready for a new family. She went on about how she would hear noises in her house, and how she kept seeing a little boy. I instantly jump up at her saying this, and I asked her, "Is he blonde? Did he look like he was about 8 or 10? She raised her eyebrow, confused, but said, "Yeah, how do you know this?" This is where I explain what we did as kids, and how we didn't believe it, until she told me what she did. Apps like that are still skeptical to me, but I don't think the set of experiences were mere coincidences. To me, this is something more, and still sends a bit of a shiver down my spine to this day. I'm going to start this out by giving some background on my mother. She's currently 58, a nurse, and a devoted Christian. Other than the occasional drink, she doesn't do anything to alter her mind. This story begins one day when my mom laid down for a nap. The way she described it, she wasn't asleep, but she began to see a video of sorts repeating in her head as soon as she closed her eyes. She saw a young teenage girl dressed in a schoolgirl outfit, floating away in a boat and waving. My mom could feel her emotions, her sadness and worry for her grandmother as she said goodbye. She could feel that this girl was going to a peaceful place. As well as this, she saw a calendar turn 3 times. This vision repeated itself once or twice, until my mother came to. She thought it was a vision of our family friend Shannon, but it didn't look quite like her. Later on, during the month of March, there was a shooting at a local rave. Shannon's younger sister was shot and killed. She was wearing the exact schoolgirl outfit that my mother saw her in during the vision. The fact that it happened in March means that the calendar was a warning of what was to come. We are unsure of why exactly my mom was meant to see this, but we were able to provide some comfort to the family by letting them know that she was somewhere safe and peaceful. This happened a couple years ago when I was working at my childhood summer camp. I've certainly gotten strange feelings around the area before, but nothing especially malevolent or frightening. My coworker and I were taking our group for a sleep out, up in some shelters about half a mile into the woods and away from the rest of the camp. I'm used to being in the woods, and I generally don't scare easily, even at night. So when I woke up in the wee hours of the morning, I set out for the latrines without a second thought. I figured it was around 4 or 5 a.m. based on a red glow on the horizon. The light fell softly through the trees, illuminating the path and the color sides of the shelters. The walk was only a few hundred yards, but felt longer with only my flashlight. I was about halfway there before I heard something behind me. Again, I know those woods. I know what most of the animals in the area sound like, from the camp's horses to the local family of black bears. Whatever this was, it was huge. Its presence seemed to close in on me from all around, and I could hear twigs snapping, vines tearing, mud squelching underfoot. I am not fast, and I knew that running on the uneven path in the dark wouldn't get me very far, so I walked. I walked like I owned those woods, slowly and deliberately until I reached the light on the side of the latrine. The presence had faded. I was even starting to feel good, confident, like I could keep going, keep walking through the dark woods until I reached the sunrise. I had to tell myself to stop, to turn where I meant to turn. I eventually returned to my shelter and fell asleep. Maybe I would have forgotten about it all if not for that sunrise. I've watched so many sunrises over the lake that I should have known better. That red light in the woods wasn't in the east, where it should have been. It was out by the western side of the pasture, blood red and a little too bright for what it was pretending to be. The more I think about it, the more it felt like I was being herded somewhere. I haven't met anyone with a similar experience, but my friends have theories from fairies to alien abduction. I'm not sure I believe that, but I'll never go to that part of the woods alone again. My girlfriend and I had found an old way through a forest that we wanted to explore at night, so we packed our backpacks and walked there at around 1:30 a.m. From the Google Maps point of view, that way should have taken us around 10 minutes. We started walking. It was dark and foggy, nothing creepy so far, until we reached a small lake. It wasn't even showing on the map. There was a small lodge next to it and a fence around it. We looked at it for a few minutes and went a little bit closer. As we almost reached the fence, a woman's scream came out of nowhere, and we just grabbed our bags and ran as fast as we could. The way we walked felt like it was all of a sudden never-ending. We ran for almost 15 minutes until we finally reached the road. We did not know what was screaming. We didn't see anything, even with flashlights. We decided to go home and wait a few more hours to go back when the sun came up. But when we went there again, we saw nothing. We went to the fence, and there was no scream. We thought that's maybe what triggered it when you got too close because of whatever was in there. But there was just nothing. Also, the way now felt super short. Like it didn't even take us 10 minutes to walk to the road, but after the scream, it felt like we were running for at least 15 minutes straight. It may just be nothing, but this was the creepiest experience that I have ever had, and I still think about it today. Also, in the following days and weeks, we checked the news for missing people or anything like that, but again, there was nothing. I am right now sitting on my front porch, smoking a cigarette. I cannot bring myself to go back inside my house. There is someone in there. Just over 2 months ago, I moved into a new house after losing nearly everything to COVID. I won't go into details or draw this out. Typing this out makes my eyes well, and every hair on my body stands straight up, but damn it, I saw a human-shaped shadow in my walk-in closet. Am I going crazy? Maybe, but I know that I am not at the same time. This is what happened. I was laying on my bed browsing Reddit, and from the corner of my eye, I caught movement coming from my closet. Within literal milliseconds, I turn and see someone standing inside of it, looking right at me. I flipped out, sprung up, ran out of my room, slammed the door, and grabbed a kitchen knife. I yelled and screamed about calling police, that I had a knife, and basically acted like a scared monkey. No response. After about a minute of yelling and screaming, and realizing that I had left my phone in my bedroom to call 911, I slowly peeked in. There was simply nothing there. Nothing. No one could have gone anywhere. I am pissed and terrified about this. I saw this person. I saw their shape, their movement, their arms. There was a humanoid figure in my closet, and that is all I know. We used to have a chair sitting in my parents' closet. It was one of those old straw ones that felt like it was going to fall apart every time you sat on it. My sister was born first, and almost every night she would stand in her crib pointing at the wall. At first, my parents had no idea what was going on, until they found out the direction she was pointing was where my parents' closet was with the chair. The same thing happened over and over until I was born 4 years later. I got the room that my sister had been in. I was 1, and when my parents saw me one night, I was doing the exact same thing, pointing at the same spot that my sister had. Time went on, and nothing happened concerning the chair. One day my parents went into their closet and found written in crayon the name Sue. My parents have never seen this before. After that, nothing else happened. The chair started to take up space, so my mom decided to take it to the place where she used to work. Our good friend had that class now, and it was all hers. It was a 5th grade science class. After about a month, my mom got a text that Sue was doing things. She said that Sue was dumping stuff off of shelves and throwing things. She said that Sue took a liking to one of her kids and messed with his hair and threw stuff directly at him. That was the last time we ever heard anything about Sue. I would definitely like to go back to see if she's still there. This is a true story. When I was in high school, I had a friend who lived near our house. We would always walk from school to our homes. We were pretty close, and we talked about anything. One time, when we were walking along the road, she suddenly spoke and said that she smelled candles. It was a busy street, and it was only around 4 p.m., I think. I replied, "It must be from the truck." I said this because one had just driven past us when she said that. She had a serious face, which was unusual because she was more talkative between the two of us. She insisted that she could still smell it as we continued walking, but stopped after a while. Fast forward to the next day. It was Saturday, and I had just woken up. I literally got goosebumps. I felt so shocked when I read her text. It said that her father had died. Do you also believe in superstitions? Here in our country, a smell of flower or candle indicates the death of a person. The area where I live is a heavily wooded Indian residential area, and we have no neighbors, and the closest town is about 15 minutes away. The only animals that come around are coyotes, black bears, sometimes wolves, and since I live in the southern part of Canada, there aren't any mountain lions that I've seen anyway. So a few nights ago around 2:50 a.m., I heard my dogs barking like crazy, and I got pretty annoyed by this because they never usually do it. It was hard for me to sleep, and I pulled out my phone to check the time, and like I said, it was almost 3. Since my bedroom has a window, I opened it to call my dogs back, and they didn't stop barking. I tried a few more times, but then I heard a sort of wailing, crying sound from the woods. I heard foxes can sometimes make screaming sounds, but this didn't sound like a fox's cry. I don't think it could have actually been a woman, considering, like I said, that we don't have neighbors. I tried telling my grandfather, but he doesn't hear it, and when I told my grandmother, she didn't want to talk about it since she can sometimes be superstitious. My mom and grandma have had similar experiences with premonitions, but I am now 21 and have been having them for the first time in my own life recently. A few weeks ago, I had a very vivid dream about my childhood best friend who I haven't seen or spoken to in years, and I woke up the next day to find out that she had committed suicide. Then this past week, I told my boyfriend that I missed our old coworker, who we also haven't seen or spoken to in a few years. And come to find out, he suddenly dropped dead about 15 minutes before I had made that comment. Today I took a nap and had another very vivid dream, very lucid, about my high school boyfriend. And now I'm a little bit freaked out, and I'll definitely be watching his social media over the coming days, hoping that this has just been a weird coincidence. In the home where I lived from ages 8 to 16, I would always hear church bells ringing early in the morning. My sister, who shared a room with me, said that she heard them as well. And this was before I ever mentioned them to her, so I know that it wasn't my imagination playing tricks on me. I never even thought it was weird until I was in my early teens, when I realized that we don't live near any churches, or at least not any active churches. I was so used to it that I'd never really even taken the time to actually consider it. When I brought it up to my mom, she had no clue what I was talking about. It was the same with my next-door neighbors and other friends from the neighborhood.